Okay, good morning or good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all as part of the Spherismon at Drisha. This is, of course, Rabbi Silber's shir on Exodus, I guess the second part this spring. So as usual, I am inviting everyone to be a panelist. That means that if you choose, we'll get to see your lovely faces, and you'll also be able to unmute to ask questions when we pause for those. Between those moments, it would be great if you could stay muted, and you can put any questions into the chat here on Zoom or on Facebook Live, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Silber. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Maxine. All right, welcome everyone. Today, I know it's Memorial Day weekend. It's also Lag BaOmer. I'm speaking to you from Yerushalayim. But we have an opportunity to learn together, and for those who can make today, great being together to continue our study of the book of Shemot. We're up to the 8th plague. We started that last week. The 8th plague is Arbet. And the 8th plague, as we began to look at it last week, the 8th plague is an interesting plague because on the one hand, the 8th plague is described as essentially a continuation of the 7th plague. The 7th plague was Bara, and that we talked about last week at some length. It's really the 7th, a very critical plague. There's all kinds of interesting pieces to it. But the end of the plague of Bara, the Torah mentioned that some of the crop was destroyed by the hail, but not all of it. The early blooming crop was destroyed, but the late blooming crop was not destroyed. That we have at the end of the Barad description. When it comes to the Arbet, to the locusts, so the Torah says, we're in chapter 10, the Torah says that the locusts will destroy V'yochal et Esev kol Esev ha'aretz Asher Hishir HaBarad, which is in chapter 10 in verse number 12, in Pasuk Yud Bet. So there it's clear that the Arbe is represented as a continuation of the plague of Barad, which really only underscores what we had talked about last week, how the 7th plague is really a critical plague. And before the 7th plague comes, Moshe had warned Paro, this time I'm bringing all of my plagues, all of my might against you, as an introduction to plague number 7 and the plagues that will follow, 7, 8, 9, and perhaps plague number 10. So the Barad, from one perspective, is a continuation of the Arbet, the locusts, from one perspective are a continuation of plague number 7. But from another perspective, as we noted last week, the Arbet also anticipate plague number 9. Plague number 9 is the plague of Choshech, the plague of darkness that we'll see soon. And the way the Arbet is described, if we look at again in chapter 10, let's find that those psukim. So it says, let's see. Yes, in pasuk number 15, chapter 10, pasuk Tedvav 15, the Arbe is described after the previous verse said that this particular plague, there's been nothing like it ever before, and nothing will follow. This is unique, a unique event. And in number 15, Vayechas et ein kol haaretz vatechshach haaretz, that the locusts hid all the land from view, and the land was darkened. So here we have Choshech. And then, of course, it continues, Vayochal et kol esev haaretz yet kol pri ha'etz asher hotir habarad. And then it continues to say that it devoured the grass of the field and all the fruits, which the hail had left. So here you have in this pasuk, it sums it all up in one pasuk, that Arbe is, from one perspective, a continuation of plague number 7, and from another perspective, it's the introduction of plague number 9. That's what we pointed out last week. The purpose of last week was mostly to underscore the significance of plague number 7. In any event, this is the plague of Arbe. So this is the Paro was, of course, warned about this, but he persists, of course, and plague comes, and now we'll see. He claims to regret what happened, but then he would once again will change his mind. Okay, I did want to address a question actually that was posed several weeks ago. I believe it was Laszlo who raised the question. I don't know if Laszlo is here with us today, but he asked the following question. I said we would deal with it in the future.
I am here. Thank
You are
you.
here. Okay, so I did want to deal with this question. And the question that he asked, he's asked several questions, but one of the questions that he asked, which I didn't respond to at the time, was this: that when God instructs Moshe to speak to Paro on several occasions, and here you have it actually in chapter 10, which is with the parsha called Bo. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Boel Paro. Vayomer, it's the first pasuk of chapter 10. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Boel Paro. That, and we had this earlier, when Moshe is instructed to speak to Paro, the language of the Torah is Boel Paro. And Lazo asked the question, which is actually, it's a very strange word to use. We might have said, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Lech el Paro. Go to Paro. Lech. Why is typically the phrase that's used not Lech el Paro, but rather Bo el Paro? So I was thinking about this question, and I have a suggestion to make. And you know, I think it raises a very interesting idea, which is this: that as we'll see, especially in the latter plagues, Moshe goes to Paro, of course, warns Paro. Paro doesn't listen. The plagues come. Then Paro asks Moshe to pray for him and to remove the plague, and Moshe does so. Now, what's interesting is that what the Torah sometimes seems to emphasize, it uses when Moshe, for example, over here in chapter 10, for example, there are many such examples. But chapter 10, in pasuk number 18, Paro asks Moshe to pray for him. And in pasuk Yud Chet, chapter 10, in verse 18, Vayetze meyim Paro, Vayetar Hashem, Moshe left Paro, walked away from Paro, and he prayed to God. The suggestion of many of the commentaries is he's not going to pray in the presence of Paro, maybe not even going to pray in the castle or the palace of Paro. He wants to go outside to pray. Vayetze Moshe, we had that earlier, and it comes up over and over again. For example, let's say in the next chapter, you have once again the God says to Moshe, there'll be one more plague, which is the plague Makat Bechorot. And there, towards the end of that, after Moshe speaks to Paro, and you're going to say, let's say chapter 11, in verse number 8, this is by there are other examples of this as well. Where Moshe says to Paro angrily, there's going to be one more plague, and after this plague, because Paro says, I don't want to see you anymore, don't come to me anymore, I'm not going to see you, says Moshe. And Moshe says, listen, this is going to be the end of it. And after the next plague, V'yardu kol avodecha ela elai, v'shtachavu li leimor tzei ata v'chol ha'am asher b'raglecha, v'yacharei chen etzei, v'yetzei miyim Paro b'chariach. So Moshe says to Paro, listen, at the end of the next plague, your servants will come down to me. This is chapter 11, verse number 8. Your servants will come to me, they'll bow down to me, and they'll say, leave, you and all the people that are with you. Afterwards, and then I will leave. And then the Torah adds, Paro b'chariach, he left the presence of Paro with great anger. So there in this little verse, you have the verb say 3 times, and we have it earlier. Where the Torah says when Moshe goes, leaves Paro's presence to pray, Vayetze Moshe, Vayetze Moshe, Vayetze Moshe. And my thought is the following, in terms of Lazarus' question. Why does the Torah say Boel Paro? Which is very strange. It should say Lechel Paro. But the Torah Dafka uses the verb to go, Boel Paro. So I think there's a very important idea here that we find elsewhere in the story. And that is that Moshe is both coming to Paro. He's coming to Paro, Boel Paro. He's Boel Paro, but he's also Vayetze meyim Paro. He comes and he goes. And this recalls for us the very beginning of this book. How does the book of Exodus begin? V'yehu Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayim. Eit Yaakov ish ubeit tov ba'u. The very first verse of the book, of this book of Exodus, twice emphasizes that Bnei Israel came to Egypt. Bnei Israel haba'im Mitzrayim ish ubeit tov ba'u. And the emphasis on the verb to come is setting up its sister verb, which is the verb to go, or tzeit. This is the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And Yetziat Mitzrayim, we underscore the fact that Israel was leaving Egypt. Yetziat Mitzrayim, Yatzatam Eretz Mitzrayim, but we all came to Mitzrayim. We were born Mitzrayim, and we are leaving. We are Yotzemi Mitzrayim. And my point is that actually, the character of Moshe, among other things, what the Torah wants to, I think, to underscore amongst many other things, is that Moshe himself, even though he's very different from the people, he's not one of the people, but Moshe is actually representing the Jewish people. And we see this in the story in two ways earlier in the book of Exodus. First of all, the very fact that Moshe is placed in this little teva, called a little ark or whatever it is, and he's placed in the water. The Hebrew boys are being drowned in the water, and Moshe himself will be rescued from the water. He'll be placed by the water, and Pharaoh's daughter will come by, and his sister's watching from a distance, and Pharaoh's daughter has pity on him and names him Moshe. I have drawn him from the water. So in that sense, Moshe is, the experience of Moshe, the life of Moshe, is parallel to, and say he can represent the Jewish people, because in a certain sense, symbolically, he's going through the same thing. That's the point number one. And point number two that we emphasized earlier was that the story of the Exodus is a fulfillment of an earlier promise, an earlier covenant, the covenant made with Abraham, the conditions of which were your descendants will be strangers, ger, and they'll be enslaved, avdut, and they'll be oppressed, inui. Avdut and inui appear in chapter 1 of this book in description of the suffering of Israel. Vayavidu Mitzrayim, kasher yanu oto. But the word, the term ger, does not appear in conjunction in the beginning of this book with Bnei Israel, but appears in conjunction with Moshe. Moshe flees the land, Pharaoh wants to kill him, and Moshe names his son Gershom, Kiomar Geroyiti, the Eretz Nachriya, and immediately in the Chumash, God sets about to redeem Israel. Israel has fulfilled its part of the bargain, of the Gerut, the Avdut, and the Inui. The Avdut and the Inui is a description of all of Israel. But the Gerut, the sense of being different, marginalized, having a different destiny, that's Moshe, actually. It doesn't say that about Israel, but Moshe's sense of Gerut, God accepts that as a fulfillment of Israel's obligation as part of the covenant to undergo the idea of Gerut. So both in those two senses, Moshe somehow represents Israel. And therefore, I think the Chumash Dafka wants to use the verbs when it comes to Moshe, Lavo v'lotzei. Because in the bigger picture of this book, in this book of Exodus, the book of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that's the very first verse. Eila Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayim eit Yaakov ishu beit tov ba'u. So that's what I was thinking in terms of Laszlo's question, which is a good question, because it is very strange to say Bo El Paro. But I think that's the reason. Perhaps there are other reasons as well. That's what came to mind. So I did want to address that question that was asked several weeks ago.
So
Okay.
if I could say something at this point. So another view that comes to mind is Lavo is typically used when you're coming to the place that you live. It's when it's your house, but it doesn't matter which direction. Into the house is ba, and out of the house is tsei. And when Israel came into Egypt, they were going to the place that would be their home. They would live there. Moshe was raised in the house of Paro. So the house of Paro was in some sense his house, which he had to leave, but when he came into it, he was returning and he was going back to that place.
That's a good insight. Yeah, I like that. That's a good insight. That's very true. And I mean, that's part of the problem. What you're saying actually is part of in the bigger picture, is one of the main issues
Yes.
of the book in general, because the idea of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and that's what the book of Exodus is actually about. In other words, there's different kinds of leaving. In other words, I remember when I was after I was 18 years old, I wasn't living at home anymore. But someone said, when I was in school, where are you going for Shabbos? Oh, I'm going to go home. Because home doesn't mean you're there most of your time. We consider places our home. We feel that's our place, even though you may only spend 20 days a year there. And the rest of the year off in school, you're traveling or whatever it is, but your home somehow, where you grow up, your family is, etc., where your early childhood is your home. And part of the issue in the book of Exodus, in this book, which really has two parts. The first part is about physically leaving Mitzrayim. We cross the sea, we're out of Egypt. You won't see them anymore. But actually, the question that occupies the second half of the book is really, can we leave Mitzrayim in the sense that that's not really our home anymore? And that's a very important question. And for example, when we studied Sefer Breshit, I made the point that there too, Yaakov describes his experience in the house of Lavan as Avdut and then Inui. He uses those two terms. But it's only after he leaves later on in the next chapter that he says, in Lavan Garti, I was a stranger in the house of Lavan. So in other words, the point is that you can leave a place, or you can even be still on the way out, but you still think of it as your place. And sometimes it takes a long time to understand that was never my place. And the challenge of the book of Exodus and the Chumash in general is, can the Jewish people who spent many years in the land of Mitzrayim, can they see themselves as separate, having a separate destiny, a separate trajectory from the land in which they grew up? This is their land. They often want to go back to Mitzrayim, and that's the challenge of the Chumash. Actually, can you envision a different place as being your place? So that is, I think, a very important point, and it works very well in terms of what you're suggesting, in terms of, your home is the place you're always coming back to, even if you're not there, you're going home. So that is, and of course we'll deal with that, which is of course the basic issue of the whole second half of Sefer Shemot, and the constant complaint take us back. Yeah.
I also gave some thought to this, but I couldn't really locate it exactly. I'll tell you how. I thought that when God says boy, it's an expression of intimacy. Is I am with you, I'm going with you, come, like holding hands kind. The only thing that bothered me about it was, why would it appear here in these two occasions, and why not earlier or even later? Later we don't have to worry about, because once the intimacy has been established, it is continuing. But given the Moshe's reluctance to take up the task, and some kind of strengthening of this mission was necessary. But why would it occur here in the story? That was my thinking.
No. I mean, but your point that God says, I will be, that's the first thing God says to Moshe at the burning bush is, Moshe says, who am I to go to Paro? And God's response was, I'm going to be with you. So that is the message from the very beginning, that I will be with you. Whether that fits in with the term bo in terms of God, that's a question I'd have to think about that. But okay, let us then continue now with. I did want to. I said I would address the bo question, so I felt I should do that. Okay, now let's get to another point about this plague of chapter. Now we're back to chapter 10 again. Just to underscore, again, we're not reading every verse here, but to underscore what are some of the basic ideas of the plagues.
Sorry, Rabbi.
Yes.
Just before we get to that, because this is addressing something closer. So there was a question from Ruth Reisner. She was saying, why is Moshe getting angry now after all of Paro's other shenanigans? What in particular is making him angry?
I don't know. Well, let me not answer that question now. And let me
Okay.
think about it. Then when we get to, he's getting more and more angry. First of all, because Paro keeps persisting. In other words, the point is, someone tricks you one time, that's one thing. Even maybe a second time. When it comes to the third time, again, it's because he's realizing there's a pattern over here, and perhaps he's getting frustrated. He really does want to leave. And as we'll see, Paro does seem initially to make certain concessions. That's one of the things we'll see today. So, outside of the fact that the very repetition is what it's true of probably of all of us. Someone tricks us once or twice, that's one thing. But when you detect a pattern over here, he is getting, and especially given the fact that the plagues, and that's how the Torah presents it, for the most part, they're more severe as we move on. So, and which is what the Chumash says, I'm sending all of my plagues against you. So the 10th plague, of course, is the worst, but the 7th plague is pretty severe as well, and the 7th and the 10th. So one could also see that Moshe is saying to himself, what's going on over here? I mean, what has to happen to get you to do the right thing? That's part of the frustration, I think. Perhaps there's more to it than that, but that's off the top of my head. That's what I would say. I did want to mention a point that I alluded to last week, and I think it's a very important point about the plagues. That when you come to the 8th plague, Moshe warns Paro about this next plague, this Arbeh plague, this locust plague, and we talked about the continuation of the Barad, etc. And this is described in the beginning of chapter 10, especially verse number 5. Again, once again, the darkness that will cover the whole land. You won't be able to see the land. It will devour all that remains from the Barad. That's in verse number 5 of chapter 10. And the locusts will fill your house, the house of all your servants, the houses of all of Mitzrayim. You have never seen anything like this before. And then Vayifen Vayetzem, here we have another Vayetzem, Vayifen Vayetzem in Paro. He leaves from. And here we have an interesting move in the story. This is an important move in the story, which is Pasuk Zayin, in verse number 7. Here we see something that we've never seen before. Vayomru avdei Paro elav ad matai yelzelanu l'mokesh shalach et ha'anashim v'yavdu et Hashem Elohehem aterem teda ki avdo Mitzrayim. So here we've never seen this before. The servants of Paro say to Paro, his own servants say to him, how long is this going to continue? Talked about the frustration, but the Egyptians are frustrated as well. What this policy that you put in place, how long are we going to continue this way? It's not working. How long shall we continue? To be a mokesh, a snare to us. Let them go, let them serve their God. Don't you realize that Egypt is lost? What does it take for you to understand this? In other words, here we have, one might say, virtually an open rebellion against Paro. Now, we saw something similar to this last week in terms of the 7th plague, the Barad, because there, when Moshe warns them about the hail that will fall down and kill all that's in the field, there the Chumash said, as you recall, that those that feared God took their cattle and their servants out of the field. The others who didn't fear God is business as usual. So there, for the first time, the Torah says there are some of the people who are taking Moshe's warnings seriously. That's true. That's in plague, and that's a very important move in plague number 7. But here it's much more than that. Here it's actually an open rebellion against Paro, which we have to presume is not a simple matter to go against the Pharaoh. Given the power of the Pharaoh, it would be, rather risky to go. And yet, the people are really feeling that this is a dangerous situation. And I just would add to this, I alluded to this last week as well, but that actually what perhaps Paro's own strategy had been to divide Israel. And it seemed to be working. Paro took away their straw. They had to produce the same number of bricks. Their Hebrew taskmasters were beaten. And then if you recall, in chapter 5, the taskmasters meet Moshe and Aaron. They say, what are you doing over here? You're giving Paro an excuse to kill us. In the past, he had to, use devices to kill us with this. They give him a sword. What is going on? And Moshe goes back to God and complains, well, what have you done? You made things are worse. So that's the idea of divide and conquer. Paro was dividing the people. Paro was dividing the leadership. Paro was turning the people perhaps against Moshe, the taskmasters against Moshe, and Moshe against God. That was Paro's strategy. And here we see the flip side of it, that in the course of the plagues, in verse number 7, very striking, that Avdei Paro say, what's going on over here? And that's interesting because in the next pasuk, in pasuk Chet, we have the following. It says, Vayushav et Moshe v'et Aaron el Paro. It's interesting, Vayushav, that Moshe and Aaron, Vayushav, they were brought back. It uses the passive. It's not exactly clear who brings them back. They were brought back to Paro. So it sounds like somebody, maybe Paro after the complaints, maybe someone else, but it uses the passive voice over here. They're brought back to Paro, and you see that actually their complaints are registering with Paro. There's an implicit, maybe even a threat against Paro. What's going on over here? We will see this theme picked up later as well, of division amongst the Egyptians. So Paro says now, okay, Paro says to them, okay, I agree. You can serve your God. Whom do you wish to take with you? Who's going? Now we have Moshe's famous answer in the 9th pasuk. Moshe, b'norenu v'zkenenu nelech, b'banenu v'vnotenu, b'tzonenu v'vkarenu nelech, b'chag Hashem lanu. Moshe says everybody's going, the young and the old, the boys and the girls, and also our cattle, because we have a chag, we have an observance. B'chag Hashem lanu. We have an observance. By the way, I came across just in passing the word chag. The word chag is an interesting word. So I'm looking at Tehillim recently. This is always a good thing to do, and I noticed that in Amos Chacham, writes a commentary on Tehillim. He suggests that the word door, we think of the word door as a generation. But the word door, he claims, for example, in the 24th Psalm, with David Mizmor, we say on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it's actually the Psalm of the day for Sunday, which is today. Zed dor dor shav, mivakshay panecha yaakov. This is the door of those who seek you. And Amos Chacham says that the word door is related to the word dur, which means a circle. Actually, the word kadur is a ball, probably related to the same word, a circle.
Or ladur, to live. Ladur is to live.
Ladur is to live, but it means people. Ladur does mean that, but he thinks it comes initially from people coming together in a circle. And what's interesting is that I think he suggests this as well, that the word chag is a holiday, right? But you have in Hebrew, and we have in modern Hebrew, the word chug, to go to a chug, right? A chug is an assembly of people. It means a circle. Well, chug, right? To make a circle. So the point is that it means the point of Chag Hashem Lanu, it means a holiday. But what Moshe is saying is it's a circle, means where everybody is included. So in some schools, people like they sit the kids in circles. So everybody can see everybody else. Everybody can see the teacher. Everybody see everybody else. And there's a sense in a circle that that there's a sense of kind of deep connection between the various participants. That's the idea of the circle.
Equality, because everybody's equidistant.
Yeah, equality. Good point. And everybody sees each other, and it's a sense of community. And they can all see the teachers, see each other, etc. That's the idea of sitting in a circle, basically. So the point is that it probably is related to the word chag, the word chug, and the word chag. And that's what Moshe is saying. I mentioned this over here because Moshe is saying all of us have to be there. All of us have to be there. And the reason, again, the question is, does he want to run away? Or is it something else? The sense of community, that we have a bunch of slaves. And part of Moshe's mission is to take these slaves and to fashion from these slaves, from different tribes, et cetera, different families, some sense of common purpose, which is one of the basic questions that the Torah raises in general. But it comes up all over the place. But over here, particularly before they can leave, my suggestion has been that he's not running away at this point. But there's no point to leave, so we first establish a sense of community. And one of the issues the Torah will wrestle with later, and it's a very central issue, and always today it's very central. It's always central. How do you take people who come from different places, different points of view, and bring people together and develop a sense of common purpose, even as we understand that people are different? That's a question for government, question for politics. It's a question for education. It's one of the questions, I think, at Drisha that's right front and center. It's not a place that believes it's just one way, but we recognize and we celebrate difference, but we've come to learn together. And that's really the task over here. That's what Moshe is saying. Everybody has to be there. But Paro doesn't want that. So Paro's response in pasuk number 10, Vayomer Alehem, Yichen Hashem imochem, kasher ashalach etchem v'yetabchem. Ri'u ki ra'a neged pneichem. Lochen, l'chuna gvarim v'yivdu et Hashem, ki ota atem mevakshim. Vayigarish ota meyet pnei Paro. So Paro says, pasuk's a little difficult. There's may God be with you. Here they translate, the same as I mean to let your dependents go with you. It's very unclear what that translation is saying, but what the sense of it is clear. He says, this is not going to happen. In other words, he actually distrusts them. I see this ra'ah neged pneichem, which the commentaries here they translate, you are bent on mischief, which does capture, I think, the sense of it. No, he says, he seems like he does suspect they're going to try to run away or something. This isn't going to happen. No. If you want to serve your God, he says, take the Gevarim, which probably here they translate gentlemen, could be older people, could be the men dafka. Take them if you want to serve God. To serve God, what do you need everybody for? Take the leadership, maybe take the men, maybe take the elders. But if you want even the boys, the girls, the children, what do you need them for? And therefore, he chased them away. He expelled them. It's like, again, clear who he is. Whoever who brought them back expels them from Pharaoh's presence. So there are a couple of points I wanted to make over here, and then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. I wanted to make the point that, remember back in the book of Breshit, Yaakov dies, the end of chapter 40, and the last chapter of Sefer Breshit, Yosef is going to Paro, and he asks permission to leave the land of Egypt and to bury his father back in the land of Mitzrayim. And he doesn't even go to Paro directly. He goes to Paro's servants. They have to plead for him. And he says, I swore to my father. And Paro says, go and bury your father as your father made you swear. And then Paro added in chapter 50 of Sefer Breshit, those who studied remember certainly what Paro said. Paro, all of Israel went up, all of Joseph went up. Joseph and his house went to bury his father. Kol Beit Yosef, v'yachav u'beit aviv, in verse number 8 of chapter 50, right towards the end of the book. Rak tapam v'tzonam uv'karam ozvu b'eretz Goshen. They left behind the children and the cattle. And when we saw that pasuk, that they left behind the children and the cattle, why does the Torah even mention that? But the suggestion at the time was that what Paro is saying to Yosef is, you can go. You can take your family, their brothers, family, maybe the wives go too, who knows, but you're coming back. He wants to make sure that Joseph comes back, and he does that in a variety of ways.
Which is what Lavan did the same thing to Yaakov.
Lavan doesn't want Yaakov to leave. Yaakov has to escape. That is certainly the case. Right. But over here, it's actually, he does exactly what Paro says. Paro said over here, you want to go serve God? You take the old people. The kids you have to leave behind. We need the cattle. The kids, the cattle, you leave that behind. And it's the same thing because he wants to make sure that they don't leave. And my point is that the first Paro, the one that Joseph deals with, the so-called good Paro, I don't believe there is a good and bad Paro. I believe they're all the same. Circumstances may change, but in the Chumash, there's no difference. And it's exactly the same thing. You can go bury your father, but the kids stay here. And this way, he's sure that Joseph has to come back. He also sent the army with him to so-called protect him, but we got to be sure that everybody's going to come back. So this is what we have over here in our story. The Paro says no. But now there's one other point I wanted to make before I stop for a moment to take comments and questions, and that is the strange expression "Ri'u ki ra'a neged pneichem." Let's get back to our verse in chapter 10. Ra'a neged pneichem. I wanted to again what I had mentioned earlier, and to call our attention to this, and we will come across this again in the Chumash, and that is that. And this, again, those who study the Bible in light of the ancient Near East or the ancient societies, which to me has a value. It's not the main thing that we do in these classes, but we certainly are aware of the fact that there are other stories and other, Israel is living in the land of Egypt. And God said, I will do war against the gods of Egypt. So the Torah alludes to the fact that Mitzrayim has many gods. In fact, when I was reading up on this, it seems they have many, many gods, but two of the main gods of Egypt, not surprising. The main god of Egypt seems to be the sun god. And the name of the sun god is actually Ra. So over here, I believe there is exactly a reference to this. Ra'u ki ra'a neged pneichem, that we see in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus story, on several occasions, the word Ra is used in very strange ways. This is one of them. And we all know that the ninth plague, 3, 3, 3, and 1, the ninth plague is the plague of Choshech. The sun can't be seen. And that, some have argued, and to me it makes a lot of sense, and we'll get to Choshech soon, but one of the aspects of the ninth plague is the plague against, as God said, I will do war against the gods of Egypt. Two of the main gods of Egypt must be the sun god is the main god of Egypt, but also, of course, the god of the Nile, which is the first plague, the plague of Dam. So God is doing battle with the gods of Egypt. You have, I'll give one other example of where there's several, where the word Ra or Ra comes up in very interesting ways. But I did want to mention one, which is extremely interesting, and it's the following story. It's not in the first half of the book of Exodus, but it's in the later part of the book of Exodus. One of the key stories of the book, one of the key stories of the Torah, no doubt, story of the golden calf. And Moshe goes up the mountain to get further instructions and to bring down the tablets. And when he's up on the mountain, the people approach Aaron and they say, build for us a god, because Moshe is missing. That's the story of the golden calf. And Moshe is told by God, when Moshe is on top of the mountain, what the people have done, they have another god. Moshe comes down the mountain. First Moshe prays to God to spare the people. He's our defense attorney. But then he comes down the mountain and he sees what's going on. And he turns to his brother Aaron, who had actually made the golden calf. This is in chapter 32. Verse number 21. Verse number 21, Moshe says to Aaron, what have you done? You brought about a terrible sin. How could you make a golden calf? Idolatry, what is this? So Aaron says to Moshe, don't get angry, my Lord. You know that the people are birah. They're in a bad way. Birahu. That's what Aaron says. You know the way they are. They're birah. They're in a bad state. They came to me, I gave in, etc. And in verse number 25, after Aaron gives his apology, his excuse, Vayar Moshe ta'am kiforuahu, kifra'o Aaron, l'shimsa b'kamehem. That's the interesting verse. Moshe saw the people kiforuahu. Porua is out of is disheveled, or translate out of control, wild. Moshe saw the people were porua, and now the Torah adds kifra'o Aaron l'shimsa b'kamehem. For Aaron had made them wild. Aaron had let them get out of control, and that they were a menace, any who might oppose them. But that's a poor translation. In other words, it's not what it means they're a menace. It means, I would say, as a disgrace before those who would attack them. He made them vulnerable, is what it means. This translation, I think, is a bad translation. But what's interesting over here, what I pointed out in the past, and others have noticed it, the word pira'o, for he had made them wild, would be written typically in the Torah, Pei Reish Ayin Vav. Para'oto would be pro. But over here, the Torah doesn't write Pei Reish Ayin Vav, which is what you would expect. The Torah writes it Pei Reish Ayin Hey. It's called the archaic Hey. Sometimes there's a Hey there instead of a Vav. But in this particular case, the Hey instead of the Vav serves two purposes. First of all, when you look at the word Pei Reish Ayin Hey, there's no vowels in the Torah. Pei Reish Ayin Hey is in every other place in the Chumash, and there are many. It's Paro.
Yeah.
Kifra'o Aaron, it's Paro. The Torahs identify Aaron in this verse with Paro, which makes sense. These are the gods who took you out of Egypt. If you believe that these gods took you out of Egypt, then you're still in Egypt. But there's something else about the Hey. It's not just that. But Pei Reish Ayin Hey is the word Ra'ah. It's exactly what Paro said to Moshe over here. Ru ki Ra'ah neged pneichem. So the Torah, by keeping the archaic Hey and not putting the normal Vav, the Torah has done two things in terms of Aaron. It's identified Aaron with Paro. And even more than that, it's identified Aaron with Ra, with the main god of Egypt. The Torah doesn't pull any punches over here. Kipra'o Aaron as a disgrace. The idolatry has weakened the people's ability to stave off their enemies. God took us out of Egypt to be God's servants. But what Aaron has done, not that Aaron wants to do it, but he feels he has to give in to the people, Kibarahu. Aaron's kind of leadership is to see where the people are and try to tweak it, try to make it a little better. You have to recognize who they are. That's what he says to Moshe. Listen, you know who these people are, and they threatened me. I figured, let's give in to them for now. I didn't realize what's going to happen. I threw into this came out. This was not anticipated. I never expected to go this far. But I try to appease them, to give in to them, because that's who they are. They're bara. And Moshe doesn't accept that. Moshe is not interested in, Moshe doesn't care where they are, actually. That's not his kind of leadership. His leadership is you set the bar high, and people will try to get there. It may take generations, it may take a long time, but that's Moshe's approach. Let's move them 2 steps. That's Aaron's approach. Let's move them 2 steps, which is an important and a valid approach in many situations. But Moshe is different. Moshe is not of the people. Moshe sets the bar high. But the word kipra'o Aaron, I said as an example, not just Paro, Pei Reish Ayin Hey, but also Ra. So there is something to this idea that the idea of Ra being the god of Egypt, and that God is doing better with the gods of Egypt. And the 9th plague, as we'll get to soon, is the plague of Choshech. Let me stop here for a moment. If there are any comments or questions of anything we've done so far, happy to hear it.
Rabbi Silber, it's a little like
Yes.
the Nachash. It's very magical and mesite, and you couldn't take Paro out of Aharon or Moshe, sort of. You could take them out of Mitzrayim. And there's double language there also. So, you couldn't, who hishtageya from what had been, so to speak.
Well, the point, as I mentioned earlier, that even though we left Egypt in chapter 15, we leave Egypt, but the golden calf is chapter 32. It's not just the golden calf. We see on several occasions where the people say, let's go back to Mitzrayim. It's not easy to leave. Remember, the Jews have been in Egypt for 3 generations. This was their home. They were part of Mitzrayim. Okay, at the end, the power turned against them. But the fact of the matter is that, for better and for worse, this had been our home. It's not easy to, when you're living in a place for a very long time, you pick up many aspects of the place. You just pick them up, and it happens even in a kind of unconscious way. We see this all the time. The Jews who were able to escape from Russia, the Russian Jews, the miracle of the Russian Jews being able to leave Russia, and many came to Israel. But there's no question that living under communist rule for so many years, and the anti-religious nature of the country and all the other aspects of living in Eastern Europe, of course it has an effect on the people. It has to. Wherever you live, no matter where you are, consciously or unconsciously, it has all kinds of effects on you. And that's what the Chumash, that's the larger project of the Chumash is, can you actually leave Egypt? I don't mean just walk out of Egypt, that we do. Can you actually leave Mitzrayim? And the truth of the matter is the generation that leaves Mitzrayim doesn't make it to the land. They can't take that next step. Story of the Raglim, they say, let's go back to Mitzrayim. Nidna Rosh v'nashuv Mitzrayim. So it's certainly the case, not just in terms of Aaron, he's the least of it, but in terms of the people. What he says is true. That's who the people are. And Moshe says, okay, I don't care. I have my vision. We aspire to my vision. But Moshe and Aaron represent 2 different kinds of leadership. And I think they're both important, depending on the situation. But I think the prevalent thinking among many people in the United States, in terms of the rabbinate, is that it's an Aaron game. You can't change the people. You move them forward a little bit. You make little small moves, and that's one kind of leadership. Anyway, let's. Anybody else for a statement? Otherwise,
yes, I had an observation.
Go ahead.
That it lines up with what you were saying about seeing, and that the 9th plague is choshech. It just seemed to me that the description of Arbe in Pasuk Hey, v'chisat ein haaretz v'lo yuchal lirot, that it has to do also, they're using the idea of sight, that you can't see it, that it's going to cover up the eye of the land. That again, it's visual. And then what Paro says is Re'u ki ra'a neged pneichem, that see, and that if we say that part of it is that it's the sun god and that it's very visual in nature, that this lines up and is sort of like preempting the next Makkah, which is Choshech, that it's sort of preparing the ground for that it has to do with the visual.
I totally agree. And you have it, again, the verses that you cite, you have it later on also in the actual description about Techshach Haaretz, in verse number 15. And we'll get to Choshech. Your point is well taken about Choshech. We'll see it in a moment about the Choshech. I did want to, I'll get to your point in just a minute or two. But I think that's an important point. I did want to mention something else about the Choshech. We had spoken about the Choshech a few weeks ago as well in one of the Psalms. And I wanted to point out something else about this whole story of the Exodus. One of the basic ideas that we have encountered, I've emphasized it very much, is that in looking at Yetziat Mitzrayim, we have to see Yetziat Mitzrayim as a fulfillment of a prior covenantal promise. The entire Haggadah is based on this idea. God made a covenantal promise to Abraham that your descendants will undergo Gerut and Abdut and Inui, and in return for this, I will take you out of it doesn't mention Egypt. I would take you out of that place. They'll leave with a lot of rechush, with a lot of wealth, and the 4th generation will return to the land, which is the story of the Torah. This is generation number 3. They're going to leave Egypt with a lot of possessions, but only the 4th generation will return to the land. But what I want to point out is, apart from the Gerut and the Abdut and the Inui that appear in chapter 1 and 2 of this book, there's something else interesting about the covenant. If you remember, when God says to Avraham, you're going to have a child, and the child is going to possess the land. I am the God who took you out of Ur Kasdim to give you the land. And Avram's response in chapter 15 of Bereshit was B'mo'edaki Rashena, which we interpreted as through what will I know? Not he doesn't doubt it, but rather he's saying B'mo'edah. What has to happen? What is our responsibility? It's a covenant, it's a two-sided deal. So you're going to give me a child and give us the land, and my descendants will possess the land. What is our responsibility? And God says, Yodoa Teda, you will know, there'll be your ger, etc. But the Chumash says when this was happening, I'll read you the verses because they're very interesting in terms of Mitzrayim. The Torah says that when God speaks to Abraham about our responsibility, that before God tells Abraham about the Gerut and the Avdit and the Inu of 400 years, etc., it says, Vayhi Hashemesh Lavo, the sun was setting, Tardema nafla al Avram, and a deep sleep came over Avram. V'hine, and behold, Eimah chashecha gedolah nofelet alav, and behold, a dread and a great darkness fell over him. So the covenant, and the dread and the great darkness actually is the verse just before God says, you should know that your descendants will be strangers, and they'll be oppressed, and they'll be enslaved. And it strikes me as interesting, given the fact that we, it's fairly clear, I think, when you read the story of the Mitzrayim, that this is a fulfillment exactly of that promise, because the Torah describes in the first and second chapters, Inui and Abdut and Gerut. And before Avram's told about this, the Torah says, and before he's told about this, what has to happen? To underscore the commitment, this awesome commitment of Avram's descendants. They'll be enslaved and they'll be tortured, molested, and they'll be marginalized. And the Torah says, before that, a deep and dark dread came over him. A deep and dark and a great darkness came over him. So the Torah is describing the Gerut and the Abdut and the Inui as a great darkness. And in light of that, no pun intended, but in light of that, we understand very well that the ninth plague, in a sense the last plague prior to Makat B'cholot, is actually the Egyptians dwell in darkness. It's a kind of midah keneged midah. That actually Israel was subjected to the great darkness, and now God will bring upon Mitzrayim the great darkness. I did want to mention that, which in the covenantal formulation. Now let me just jump to the plague of darkness now, which is plague number 9. There are a couple of other points I wanted to make about the Arbe, but let's leave this. I'll get back to it perhaps. The plague of Choshech, once again, is the 9th plague, and of course it starts in chapter 10 in Pasuk Kaf Aleph in verse 21. Remember that plague number 3 and plague number 6 and plague number 9, those 3 plagues are missing in one of the Psalms, which has 7. It doesn't have 3, 6, and 9. 3, 6, and 9 are plagues that there's no warning for. Plagues 1, 2, plagues 4, 5, plagues 7, 8, Moshe warns Paro before. 3, 6, and 9, there's no warning. And one can understand that as one can see these plagues as, in a sense, a kind of response to Paro's misbehavior after plague 7 and 8, after 1 and 2, after 4 and 5. There's an additional plague now, which can be seen as a kind of response to Paro's poor behavior. So, Vayom Hashem el Moshe, in 21, Neteyotcha al Hashemayim, v'choshech al eretz Mitzrayim, v'yamesh choshech. So stretch your hand over the skies. There'll be darkness over the land of Egypt. V'yamesh choshech. What does it mean, v'yamesh choshech? So the translation we have before us, the Sefaria, this is the Sefaria is JPS. JPS translation has pluses and minuses. Sometimes they are willing to give up a certain amount of precision in for the poetic side. But in any event, but what does V'yamesh Choshech mean? So the JPS translation, which is only a possibility, a darkness that can be touched. With such a deep darkness, you feel you can actually touch it. You have the word like V'mashesh, you have it. V'yimashesh lo kol what Jacob said to his mother, to Rivka, Ulai yimusheni avi. You want me to dress up like
Ulai musheni avi.
Ulai yimusheni avi. My father will touch me, touch me, and I realize that I'm not Esav. Because Esav is hairy, I'm smooth. Ulai yimusheni, and with love and vayimashesh lo kol lo matzah. So the JPS translation is a darkness that can be touched, a deep darkness, not a normal darkness, a deep darkness. That's what JPS. Rashi and the Rashbam are different. Yes?
It's palpable.
Yeah, exactly. Palpable, exactly. Palpable darkness. That's good. That's a very good. That's what JPS is suggesting. That's solely a good option. Rashi though and the Rashbam say exactly the same thing. You got to wonder about that. Rashbam is Rashi's grandson. It's a different approach, but he actually learned with Rashi. He studies with his grandson. He actually studied. I often say about the Rashbam, he learned Chumash with Rashi. You know what I mean? Because he actually learned Chumash with Rashi. And sometimes what the Rashbam says is word for word the same as Rashi. So, although his approach is radically different than Rashi. Rashi is the voice of the Midrash very often. And Rashi is more complicated than that, but often Rashi has Midrashim, the Rashbam does not. Rashbam says the Pshuto Shel Mikra. But they both say the same thing, that V'yomesh Choshech, they think is related to the word Emesh. Emesh means last night. And they have sometimes the word, sometimes there's a mistake. Give other examples where there's a letter that's missing. It should be V'yomesh Choshech, with the missing aleph. The Rashbam gives examples, and Rashi gives the same examples. Interesting. So Emesh means last night. Their translation is, when I say that the darkness of the night continues into the day. That's V'yomesh Choshech. Not to touch, but it continues. Normally, at nighttime there's darkness. In the morning is boker, is the dawn, right? Is the rays of light. But in this particular case, for Mitzrayim, V'yomesh, it's Emesh. It's going to, the darkness continues. There seems to be no end to the darkness. So now that's what Moshe is told to do. And the next verse, Vayet Moshe et yodo hashamayim, Vayichoshech aferah, Choleretz Mitzrayim shoshet yamim, and for 3 days, a thick darkness descended upon the land of Egypt for 3 days. Let's continue the next verse. It says, Lo ro ish et achiv, lo kamu ish mitachtav shoshet yamim, ulcho b'nei Yisrael haya'or b'moshvotam. So this is actually such an interesting plague. The first one on the most simple level. I mean, I mentioned the business of the sun god. Okay, I didn't invent the sun god business, but I've read about it. And actually, the one who told me about, I remember as a kid, my mother mentioned this to me about Ra, the sun. My mother was a history teacher. I remember, and she loved Chumash and stuff like that. I remember saying to me, the god of Egypt is named Ra. So whatever. I remember as a little kid, and I do remember that to this very day. That she's the one that mentioned this to me. Then later on, you read there's a lot of stuff about Ra and the sun god, etc. But what's interesting is, in terms of the simple shot over here, is that the Torah emphasizes that they couldn't see each other. Two things the Torah emphasizes: Lo ro ish et achiv, they couldn't see each other. V'lo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet, and for 3 days, no one could move about. They couldn't leave their place. You live in the city, you don't realize how dark it gets at night. Especially if there's no moon out. I mean, it's so dark, but we don't typically experience that because in the city, there's always lights. There's lights of the cars, there's lights of the street, there's all kinds of light. Buildings have lights, but electric. But if you don't have any light, it's so dark. But here the point is, the Torah said 2 things about the plague of Choshech, apart from the sun god business. That actually, first of all, ro ish et achiv. Remember, this whole project of the plagues and Moshe's idea of let us go out to the desert together, all of us, to serve God together, is to build a sense of nation, a sense of people, and a sense of community. And the idea of not being able to see the other, to break down. We saw this already with Paro, the sermons of Paro in the 8th plague. Over here, one can't see the other. And not only that, well, kamu ishmi tachtav shloshet yamim. It's hard to miss this. No one got up for 3 days from their place. We all remember what Moshe had said to Paro. We want to go off on a 3-day journey into the desert to serve our God. Paro refuses that. So now with the kind of quid pro quo, well, kamu ishmi tachtav shloshet yamim. You didn't let the Israel go out for 3 days into the desert to serve their God and to form a community and to be a people that serves God together. So the punishment of Mitzrayim is lo kamu ishmi tachtav shloshet yamim, as I mentioned before. The Torah's description, as it were, in chapter 15 of Breshit, of the Gelut, the Abdut and the Inui, is Chashechad v'dolah nofelet alav. The Torah describes that in a sense as a deep darkness. And now what the Israelites suffered in Mitzrayim is now imposed upon the Egyptians, the breaking down of community, not being able to see the other, and especially not being able to leave for 3 days. But for all Bnei Israel, there was light in their dwellings. Here we come to a very important, critical distinction between Bnei Israel and Mitzrayim, that actually, that basically, this takes us back to the very beginning of Sefer Shemot, but it also takes us back to the very beginning of Sefer Breshit. That actually, and we've encountered this on more than one occasion, the idea of the book of Exodus, the book of Genesis is the book of creation and the formation of the family, but the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, is the formation of the nation. It's the moving from family to nation. It's also creation. It's the creation of a people. That's how the book begins. That's it's about building the nation, first numerically, and then we have to build the nation in terms of values and what makes us a people. We're going to live around the Mishkan. We're going to have a common sense of purpose and a sense of service. That's all true, and it's not so easy to develop that. But we all remember the very beginning of the story of Moshe. A man marries a woman from the house of Levi, and she conceives, and Vatera oto kitovu. She saw he was tov. And Rashi comments right on the spot. I mean kitovu. One mother thinks the child newborn is not tov. But kitovu, says Rashi, the house was filled with light. It's the first creation. And the fact of the matter is that Moshe, as I said before, Moshe is representing the Jewish people. And I pointed out 3 ways in which his experience is the experience of the Jewish people. And the goal is to create the light. The goal is to find the light which can guide the people. In fact, throughout the desert, it will be the Amud Eish and Anan that will guide us through the desert, God's light. The story of the sneh is the small light. The story of Sinai is the great light. And over here, you already see over here that Chumash is emphasizing the difference. And it takes us back to the very beginning of the Chumash, which the Chumash speaks about Choshech al Pnei Tahom, that the deep waters were covered with darkness. And God said, let there be light. And the Torah says, Vayavdel Elohim bein ha'or bein ha'choshech, and God separated the light from the darkness. And the light God called Yom, and the darkness was Laila. So here you have basically in the plague of Choshech, you really see that what the Chumash, once again, one of the many things that the Chumash is doing in the course of the plagues is suggesting connections back to creation. The book's about the creation of the Jewish people, which is supposed to be a light to the nations, right? And that's what it's supposed to be in any event. And the fact is that conversely, upon Mitzrayim is being who have persecuted the Jews, and therefore who have extinguished the light or prevent the light from growing, they're subject to the Choshech. And God here is, and here we have this division. We had the division earlier already in the fourth plague. The Arov will go to your land, Goshen will be spared. But over here, it's very striking. It's one thing to say the pack of animals will go to this place and not to the other place. But the idea that in one part of the country, throughout the entire country, there's darkness, there's no sun at all. But in this little enclave of Jews, there's or. That's miraculous. That stands out. You really have a distinction being drawn between the light and the dark, and this will come up later as well. The Chumash later is going to play with this idea of light and darkness in a chapter that we'll encounter in a few weeks, hopefully. But the theme will come up again, the theme of darkness and the theme of light. So the plague of Choshech, then, in a certain sense, it's the last plague. It's only this 3, 3, and 3, and we saw the pattern of 3, 3, and 3. But here we have, I think, this plague of Choshech symbolically being very significant. I did want to make one other point, and then I'll stop and take comments and questions. In terms of the plagues, in the Haggadah that I wrote together with Rachel first many years ago, so that was 10, 11 years, 12 years already, I know. It's also translated to Hebrew. I have a chapter about the plagues. And in that chapter, I talk about ways to divide the plagues. One way to divide the plagues is 5 and 5. Dever is the 5th plague, and Makat B'chavot is the 10th plague. That's one way the Haggadah divides the plagues. Then, of course, there's 3, 3, 3, and 3, 3, 3, and 4. Tetzach Hadash B'Achav, Rabbi Yehuda Inotem B'Hem Simanim. But the Haggadah has another way to divide the plagues, if you remember. In that last verse, that God took us out of Mitzrayim, what the Biyod Chazakah, B'Zor Nutiyah, U'v'moreim Gedolim, U'v'otot, U'v'moftim. 5 different ways in which God took us out of Egypt. And remember, the Haggadah says, Davar Acher, Biyod Chazakah Shtayim, U'v'zor Nutiyah Shtayim, U'v'moreim Gedolim Shtayim, U'v'otot Shtayim, U'v'moftim Shtayim. Haggadah says there's another way to describe the 10 plagues, not 3, 3, and 4, not 5 and 5. There's another way, 2, 2, 2, 2, and 2. That's what it says, right? These 5 terms each refer to 2 plagues. So divide the 10 plagues into 2, 2, 2, 2, and 2. And if you divide them into 2, 2, 2, 2, and 2, actually, you think about it, that's a division that makes a heck of a lot of sense, actually. So let's think about the plagues. The first 2 plagues are Dam and Svardeya. And those are 2 plagues that affect the waters, affect the deep, right? Those are plague number 1 and plague number 2. Plague number 3, Kinim and Arov, those are plagues which are similar. Actually, in one of the Psalms, it seems to connect those 2 very deeply. Kinim is lice, Arov, a mixture of something. Some people think even mixture of insects. Well, we can see these are mixtures of something that come in it, right? That's plague number 3 and 4. Dever and Shchin, pestilence and boils, those are basically, we would call them illnesses, right? Those are illnesses. Dever is some kind of an illness. Shchin, boils, is some kind of an illness, whatever it is. We can see that Dever and Shchin that is, 2 illnesses. Barad and Arba that we spoke about, those 2 are deeply connected because Barad is the 7th plague and Arba is a continuation of Barad. Arba destroys the crops that Barad didn't destroy. Of course, some of the crops hadn't grown yet. So 2, 2, 2, 2. And then if you divide it this way, Choshech is connected to Choshech is the 9th plague that becomes the last 2 is Choshech and Makat B'chorot. And those 2 actually, if you think about those 2 seem very, very different. But again, one thing that's interesting to think about in terms of Choshech and Makat B'chorot, we have already encountered those 2 as being deeply connected. Where do we encounter Choshech and, in a sense, Makat B'chorot, or Choshech and destruction coming together? That, of course, is in the parallel story to Yetziat Mitzrayim that we studied. That's the story of Sodom. The story of Sodom, which is the story of Mitzrayim, story of Sodom in chapter 19. We've noticed how many connections between the 2 stories. There's so many connections. But in the story of Sodom, the people surround the house of Lot and they wanted to molest Lot, maybe kill him. And the angels in the house smite, the malachim, smite the sodomites with sanverim, with blindness. And they can't see, they can't find the house. They can't see. That's and then the destruction of Sodom. God rains down on Sodom with fire and sulfur, etc. And so those two are, right? The angel will go through Egypt, the avenging or destroying angel. So you have the darkness and destruction in Sodom. And one might say you can read the plagues the same way. Given the many parallels between Sodom and Mitzrayim, the last two plagues, Choshech and Makat Becharot, work very well together. It's precisely what we have in the story of Sodom. That's another way to divide the plagues. The Haggadah offers us three different ways to divide the plagues. Let me stop here then and take comments and questions. I have something else I did want to talk about, but we'll have to do that next week, because that will take us some time in terms of the 10 plagues in general. And then next week we'll start with the introduction to the last plague, and that will take us to the story of the Korban Pesach, etc. And it's again one of the themes that we have encountered here with Choshech, and the larger project is, and the issue, which is a contemporary issue, which comes up probably all the time, but now it's front and center, which is both in Israel and the States. How do we bring people who have different points of view together? How do we are able to live with disagreement? And we want people to be able to speak their minds, but the other, to recognize that we have a lot in common and we have to work together. That's a challenge that always faces us. And I was thinking about it, especially today's Lag BaOmer. We know about the stories of Lag BaOmer, Rabbi Akiva's pupils, etc. They had disagreements. They couldn't figure out a way to work together. And Lag BaOmer is the day when that stopped. And actually we celebrate that, and we reflect upon this need to be able to find ways to hear the other person and to find ways to work together on issues that are important to all of us. So it's always a question, but in today's world, especially, whether in the States, I'm in Yerushalayim now, and it's a pressing, not depressing issue. Let me stop here. We'll deal with the plagues, with another element of the plagues next week. Right. We have a couple more minutes. Comments or questions? Let's hear.
So Rabbi Silber, about the Choshech, it muddles their identity. They're no longer living that oceanic feeling. I mean, they need a big group to always destroy. There's no individual thinking. So it goes from Choshech, muddling your identity, to the horrible part of losing the primogeniture. So that's like a connection too. They lose their children, So it's very, very stark.
Right, of course, it's loss of your own identity. To some extent, I would say, if you can't see the other person, I believe you lost your identity also. In other words, the point is we recognize who we are to some extent by being able to hear the other voices and to come to, sometimes we accept what the other people are saying, and sometimes it clarifies. The idea of people coming together, in terms of my teaching in Drisha, is not to get people to accept the other one's opinion. That's not the point of it. But the point is to understand the other person, even when we disagree. But often it helps clarify our own thinking. When you hear different points of view, very often it sharpens our own understanding of what we think. It gets us to sometimes to modify, sometimes to deepen our understanding. So the idea of learning together with other people, hearing them and trying to figure out and be able to hear what they're actually saying, agree or disagree. I think that's important for our own identity, and not just in terms of assisting somebody else, but it's important for ourselves. Does anybody else have something to say? And I'll stop.
Yes,
Yes. Go ahead.
I had 2 points that I thought. One is that I'm just remembering. One was that, call on somebody else. I'll get back to you.
Is there anybody else? I'm not sure there is. That's it.
There was a question. Sorry.
Yes,
Go for it, Justin. You've been waiting for a while.
Okay. Just quickly, in Arabic, Hajj has the same equivalence, at least physically, as in the Hebrew, and it seems that a lot of the observances around Hajj seem to equate to go encircling things. So just
right. There's the word Chag and Hajj. Maybe again, I don't know Arabic, but yeah, the idea of going out with others. I mean, a circle is actually we have that term circle. You know, it is. Again, it's about not just equality, but be able to hear, to see the other person, which is what you have with Choshen. They couldn't see each other. Even by the way, to see and to understand, I see what we have in English the expression. Oh, I see what you're saying, right? That's how we talk in English. In other words, it means to see is also to perceive, right? In English, to perceive is to see. I see your point. So the idea of seeing the other and being seen and being recognized that I could take my place at the table. I think that's very important that in terms of education, that people have to be able to understand that they have a place, and the institutions have to provide places for everybody to be able to be seen and to be heard. And nobody should be excluding or acting in a way that excludes others from being heard. It's another contemporary issue, which I think is of immense concern. But but the word Chag, this was I saw for Los Chacham, the word Dor also. And Dor and Chag relates to the idea of a circle.
But you also have, along that idea, you have enlightenment. To enlighten somebody, that's the same thing.
For sure. The idea of
so the thought I had was, one, it's ironic when we say that the La Yudimai Ta'or, the only people who noticed that were the Jews, because the Egyptians could not notice that the Jews had light. So it was only the Jews who could see that they had been spared. Right?
Well, maybe I'm not sure, because if you're living in darkness and there's a light far off, you can actually see that light. No,
but this
I'm
wasn't.
not sure.
But this was, heavy. The other thought I always had was when it says that they couldn't move. Sometimes you can't move because you're terrified, and if it's dark and it's the 9th plague, and you have had all these supernatural occurrences happening to you, if it's now dark, you might be so paralyzed by fear that you cannot move because you don't know what's out your door, whether it's, it's going to be hailing or there might be an earthquake. It could be anything, because nothing has been normal for the past few months. So if you can't see what's out there, you might be terrified of going out there.
Could be, right. So it is dark. There are people who are afraid of the dark. Let's start with that. But this is not a normal darkness.
Right.
It's a palpable darkness, which it goes beyond, Part of the idea of living, I'll just conclude with the following thought, that everybody has dark moments in their lives. One of the things that I think can help people get through it is a sense that darkness will come to an end. There's going to be an end to the darkness. Kate Samra Choshech, there's going to be an end to the darkness. When the darkness persists beyond any bounds that are normal, that's when it becomes terrifying, because you wonder, is this ever going to end? That's what you wonder about. The idea of the idea of the light at the end of the tunnel, the idea of the hope that has this vision, or messianic vision, or whatever. That's what has, I think, helped many people in terms of our own Jewish history. I think that that has helped us get through some quite terrible times, and we've found ways somehow to, even in the darkest places, to be able to hold out, for the most part, hold out hope. Sometimes it's difficult, but when the darkness persists beyond any imagined, normally there's going to be the morning will come, right? Here comes the sun, but what if the sun doesn't come? One day after the next. That's part of the terror of the night. And let me stop here then. Next week, I wanted to say something else about the plagues, which I think interesting point about the plagues from a different perspective. But then we'll continue with our learning, and I think there's a break at some point. I've decided that even I'm going to add some more classes during the summer. Usually in June, June, July, there's no classes. But I've decided to add, I think, 4 or 5 more classes. So we'll just continue with our study through Shemot. Of course, we'll have a stopping point and new people can join, obviously. But okay, happy Lag BaOmer, and look forward to learning with you again.
Thank you so much. Enjoy Israel. Thank God you're there. Yeah. Kol tov, toda.
And looking forward to seeing everyone next week. And also today at 1 p.m., Rabbi A.B. Wallfish is teaching the weekly Mishnah in depth. We're looking at Soto right now, which is really fascinating. I encourage everyone to join if you can. See you then or next week. Bye. Oops.
Thank you, Maxine. Toda.